Lonely rancher. Found a native boy, hiding in his barn. He was running from his own tribe. The sound that woke Jeremiah Whitman from his restless sleep was not the familiar rustle of cattle or the whisper of wind through the prairie grass, but something far more troubling, the muffled sob of a terrified child. As he crept through the pre-dawn darkness toward his barn, lantern in one hand and rifle in the other, Jeremiah had no way of knowing that the Lakota boy hiding in his hayloft would challenge everything he thought he understood about family, loyalty, and the price of standing up for what was right. What 12-year-old Two Bears was running from was not the white man's world, but the ancient traditions of his own people that demanded a terrible sacrifice he was too young and innocent to make. Jeremiah had been ranching the remote grasslands of the Dakota Territory for 15 years, building a life of deliberate solitude on 3,000 acres of rolling prairie that stretched to the horizon in every direction. At 51, he was a man carved from the same hard clay as the land itself, weathered by decades of frontier life, but still possessed of the quiet strength that had carried him through the loss of his wife to smallpox and his only son to a riding accident that had left him, with nothing but memories and an empty house that echoed with ghosts. His ranch was a monument to stubborn perseverance, built from local stone and timber hauled across hundreds of miles of trackless wilderness. The main house stood like a fortress against the elements, its thick walls and deep-set windows designed to withstand the howling blizzards that could last for weeks during the brutal Dakota winters. Behind it, a massive barn housed his prized Hereford cattle and the horses that were his lifeline to the outside world, while a network of corrals and outbuildings spoke to the careful planning and relentless work that survival in this harsh land demanded. The isolation that might have driven other men to madness suited Jeremiah perfectly. After losing everything that had given his life meaning, he had sought refuge in the honest work of raising cattle and the harsh beauty of a landscape that asked nothing of him but competence and determination. His nearest neighbor lived 40 miles away, and the closest town was a hard 3-day ride through territory that was still contested between various Lakota bands and the ever-expanding wave of white settlement. Jeremiah had always maintained careful neutrality in the conflicts that periodically swept across the territory. Unlike many ranchers who viewed all Native Americans as enemies to be defeated or obstacles to be removed, he understood that the land he now called home had been Lakota territory for countless generations. His approach was based on practical coexistence rather than the fear and hatred that motivated so many frontier conflicts, and over the years he had developed working relationships with several tribal leaders who occasionally passed through his range. The morning that would change everything began like countless others, with Jeremiah rising before dawn to check on his cattle and begin the daily routine that kept his operation running smoothly. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and a light frost covered the grass like a blanket of silver needles that crunched beneath his boots as he walked toward the barn to begin the morning feeding. It was the unusual behavior of his horses that first alerted him to the presence of an intruder. The animals were restless and alert, their ears pricked forward, and their attention focused on something in the upper reaches of the barn that Jeremiah could not see from ground level. Years of frontier life had taught him to trust the instincts of his animals, and their obvious unease suggested that something was definitely wrong. Moving carefully through the barn, Jeremiah climbed the wooden ladder that led to the hayloft, his rifle ready, but his finger off the trigger in case the intruder proved to be nothing more dangerous than a wild animal seeking shelter. What he found instead was something that stopped him cold. A young Native American boy, perhaps 12 years old, huddled in the far corner of the loft like a wounded animal seeking refuge from predators. The child was clearly Lakota, dressed in traditional clothing that was now torn and stained from hard travel over rough terrain. His long black hair was matted and dirty, and his dark eyes held the hollow look of someone who had witnessed things far beyond his years. Most disturbing were the fresh cuts and bruises that covered his exposed skin, suggesting that he had been running hard and fast through difficult country for some time. "Easy, son," Jeremiah said softly, setting his rifle aside and raising his hands to show they were empty. "I am not going to hurt you." The boy pressed himself further back into the corner, his eyes darting between Jeremiah and the ladder that represented his only escape route. When he spoke, It was in rapid Lakota that Jeremiah could not understand, but the tone was clearly pleading and desperate. "Do you speak English?" Jeremiah asked gently. The boy nodded hesitantly, then whispered in a voice barely audible above the rustle of hay, "Little bit." "What is your name?" "Two Bears," the child replied, his accent heavy but his pronunciation clear enough to understand. "That is a strong name," Jeremiah said, slowly moving closer but being careful not to appear threatening. "Two Bears. Are you hurt? Do you need help?" The question seemed to break something inside the boy, and he began to sob with the exhausted desperation of someone who had reached the absolute limit of his endurance. Through his tears, he managed to gasp out words in broken English that painted a picture of terror and desperation that made Jeremiah's heart ache with sympathy. "They want to take me away," Two Bears whispered. "To the sacred mountain. I do not want to go. I am too scared." Jeremiah felt a chill run down his spine as he began to understand what the boy was running from. He had heard stories from tribal contacts about certain Lakota ceremonies that required young people to undergo dangerous spiritual trials, rituals that sometimes resulted in death or permanent injury to participants who were considered too weak or unworthy to complete them successfully. "Who wants to take you?" Jeremiah asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The elders," Two Bears replied, his voice trembling with fear. "And my grandfather. He says it is time for me to become a man. But I know I am not ready. I know I will die if I go." The full scope of the child's dilemma began to become clear to Jeremiah. Two Bears was apparently being pressured to participate in some kind of traditional coming-of-age ceremony that he felt unprepared for, and rather than face what he perceived as certain death, he had chosen to run away from his own people and seek refuge in the white man's world. "How long have you been running?" Jeremiah asked. 3 days, Two Bears replied. "Maybe 4. I lost count. I have been hiding during the day and walking at night, trying to get far enough away that they cannot find me." Jeremiah could see that the boy was suffering from exhaustion, dehydration, and hunger that would soon become life-threatening if not addressed immediately. But he also understood that harboring a runaway Lakota child could have serious consequences for his own safety and his carefully maintained neutrality in regional conflicts. "Two Bears, I need to get you some food and water," Jeremiah said, making his decision based on the simple principle that a child in need trumped all other considerations. "Will you come down from the loft so I can take care of you properly?" The boy hesitated, clearly torn between his desperate need for help and his fear that this white rancher might turn him over to his pursuers. Finally, hunger and exhaustion won out over caution, and he allowed Jeremiah to help him down from the loft and into the ranch house. Inside, Jeremiah quickly prepared a substantial meal from his stores of preserved meat, bread, and canned goods, watching in amazement as Two Bears consumed the food with the desperate efficiency of someone who had not eaten properly in days. Between bites, the boy gradually shared more details of his situation and the circumstances that had driven him to seek refuge with a stranger. Two Bears was the grandson of a respected Lakota medicine man, he explained, and tribal tradition demanded that he undergo a vision quest at the sacred mountain when he reached his 12th birthday. The ceremony involved spending 4 days and nights alone on the mountain without food or water, seeking spiritual visions that would guide him into manhood and determine his place within the tribe. "Many boys do not survive," Two Bears said quietly, his young face showing wisdom far beyond his years. "Some die from the cold or from thirst. Others are attacked by wild animals. My grandfather says that those who die were not meant to be warriors, but I think they were just too young and scared, like me." Jeremiah felt his anger rising at the thought of adults forcing children to undergo such dangerous ordeals in the name of tradition. While he respected Native American customs and understood that he was viewing these practices through the lens of his own cultural background, he could not accept that any tradition was worth risking the life of a child who was clearly not ready for such a challenge. "What happens if you refuse to go?" Jeremiah asked. "I will be cast out from the tribe," Two Bears replied sadly. "My grandfather will disown me, and I will have no family, no place to belong. But if I go to the mountain, I will probably die. Either way, I lose everything." The impossible choice facing this young boy struck Jeremiah as fundamentally unjust, and he found himself thinking about his own son, who had died at about the same age in a tragic accident that still haunted his dreams. The idea that anyone would deliberately place a child in mortal danger for any reason filled him with protective fury that surprised him with its intensity. Over the following days, as Two Bears recovered his strength and began to trust his white protector, Jeremiah learned more about the complex family dynamics that had created this crisis. The boy's parents had died in a cavalry attack several years earlier, leaving him in the care of his grandfather, a traditional medicine man who was determined to raise him according to the old ways regardless of the cost. "My grandfather loved me once," Two Bears said during one of their conversations by the fire. "But since my parents died, he has become hard and angry. He says that the old ways are dying and that he must make me into a warrior before it is too late. He does not listen when I tell him I am not ready." Jeremiah could understand the grandfather's motivations, even while disagreeing with his methods. The traditional Lakota way of life was indeed under constant assault from white settlement and government policies designed to force Native Americans onto reservations and destroy their cultural identity. An old man watching his world disappear might well become desperate to preserve what he could, even at the cost of individual lives. But understanding the grandfather's position did not make Jeremiah any more willing to send Two Bears back to face a trial that the boy clearly felt unprepared for. As the days passed and no search parties appeared at his ranch, Jeremiah began to hope that perhaps the boy's family had given up looking for him or had assumed he was dead. That hope was shattered on a cold morning 2 weeks after Two Bears' arrival, when Jeremiah looked out his window to see a group of Lakota riders approaching his ranch house. There were perhaps a dozen warriors, all armed and moving with the purposeful determination of men on a serious mission. At their head rode an elderly man whose bearing and regalia marked him as a person of great importance within the tribe. Jeremiah stepped onto his porch to meet them, his rifle within easy reach but his hands empty in a gesture of peaceful intentions. Two Bears appeared beside him, his young face pale with fear, but his jaw set with determination that spoke well of his courage. "I am Standing Wolf," the elderly leader announced in excellent English, his weathered face showing the stern dignity of someone accustomed to command. "I have come for my grandson, who was stolen from our camp by enemies who wished to corrupt him with white man's ways." "Your grandson was not stolen," Jeremiah replied carefully. "He came to me seeking help because he was afraid of something you wanted him to do." Standing Wolf's dark eyes flashed with anger at this challenge to his authority. "The boy is young and foolish. He does not understand the importance of the trials that will make him into a man and a warrior. You have filled his head with weak ideas that will destroy his spirit and make him unfit to live among his people. I have given him food, shelter, and the chance to think about what he wants to do with his life," Jeremiah replied. "These seem like reasonable things to offer a frightened child." The confrontation might have escalated into violence if Two Bears had not stepped forward to address his grandfather directly. Speaking in rapid Lakota, the boy made what was clearly an impassioned plea for understanding and compassion. Standing Wolf listened with growing anger, occasionally interrupting with harsh responses that made the boy flinch but did not cause him to back down. "What is he saying?" Jeremiah asked when the conversation paused. "He is telling his grandfather that he is not ready for the vision quest," one of the younger warriors translated. "He says he needs more time to grow strong and brave before he can face the sacred mountain." "And what does his grandfather say?" "That the boy has been poisoned by white man's weakness and must be cleansed by the ancient trials before it is too late to save his soul." The impasse seemed complete, with neither side willing to compromise on what they saw as fundamental principles. Standing Wolf was determined to preserve traditional ways and transform his grandson into a proper Lakota warrior, while Two Bears was equally determined not to participate in a ceremony that he believed would kill him. It was Jeremiah who finally suggested a solution that might satisfy both parties while protecting the boy's welfare. "What if Two Bears were allowed to spend more time preparing for his vision quest?" he proposed. "He could learn the skills and knowledge he needs to survive the trial, and when he feels ready, he can choose to undergo the ceremony with a real chance of success." Standing Wolf considered this suggestion with obvious skepticism. "And who would provide this training?" "You, white man. What do you know of Lakota traditions and the ways of the warrior?" "Not me," Jeremiah replied. But perhaps there are elders among your people who could work with Two Bears to prepare him properly, instead of simply throwing him into a situation he is not ready for. The proposal sparked a lengthy discussion among the Lakota riders, with various warriors offering opinions about the feasibility and wisdom of delaying the traditional ceremony. Jeremiah could not understand the details of their conversation, but he could see that opinion was divided between those who supported Standing Wolf's hard line and others who seemed more sympathetic to Two Bear's situation. Finally, a middle-aged warrior who had been listening thoughtfully to the debate addressed Standing Wolf directly. His words seemed to carry special weight, and the old medicine man's expression gradually shifted from anger to thoughtful consideration. "What did he say?" Jeremiah asked. "He reminded my grandfather that many great warriors did not undergo their vision quest until they were older and better prepared," Two Bears translated quietly. "He said that forcing someone to face the sacred mountain before they are ready is more likely to create a coward than a hero." The intervention of this respected warrior seemed to break the deadlock, and gradually a compromise began to emerge from the group discussion. Two Bears would be allowed to return to the tribe without immediately undergoing his vision quest, but he would be required to begin intensive training with experienced warriors and elders who would prepare him for the ceremony over the following year. Most importantly, when the time came for him to face his trial, it would be his choice whether to proceed or to accept exile from the tribe. No one would force him to undertake the vision quest against his will, but he would have to live with the consequences of his decision. "This is acceptable to you?" Standing Wolf asked his grandson. Two Bears looked at Jeremiah, seeking guidance from the man who had become his protector and advocate. "What do you think?" he asked in English. "I think it sounds like a fair compromise," Jeremiah replied. "You get time to prepare and the right to make your own choice when you feel ready." The boy nodded slowly, then turned back to his grandfather. "I accept these terms," he said in Lakota. The formal negotiations that followed took most of the day, with various details being worked out regarding Two Bears' training and the conditions under which he would eventually face his coming-of-age trial. Jeremiah found himself included in many of these discussions, as the Lakota leaders seemed to recognize that he had played a crucial role in finding a peaceful solution to what could have become a serious crisis. "You have shown wisdom in protecting my grandson while helping him find a path back to his people," Standing Wolf said, as the agreements were finalized. "This is the action of a man who understands that children must be guided with patience rather than forced with violence." "I lost my own son when he was about Two Bears' age," Jeremiah replied. "I could not stand by and watch another child suffer when I had the power to help." Standing Wolf nodded with understanding that seemed to come from his own experiences with loss and grief. "Perhaps you would consider visiting our camp during Two Bears' training. He has spoken highly of your wisdom, and our young people could benefit from learning about the white man's world, from someone who shows respect for our ways." The invitation was both an honor and a responsibility that Jeremiah had not expected. Over the following months, he found himself making regular trips to the Lakota camp, where he served as an informal teacher and cultural ambassador, while watching Two Bears grow stronger and more confident under the guidance of experienced warriors. The boy proved to be a quick learner when given proper instruction and encouragement, rather than threats and ultimatums. His skills with horses, weapons, and woodcraft improved dramatically, while his understanding of tribal traditions and spiritual practices deepened through patient teaching rather than forced participation. Most importantly, Two Bears began to develop the confidence and inner strength that would be essential for surviving his eventual vision quest. The scared child who had hidden in Jeremiah's barn gradually transformed into a young man who could face challenges with courage and determination. When the time finally came for Two Bears to make his choice about the vision quest, he was ready both physically and mentally for the ordeal. The ceremony that had once terrified him now seemed like a natural next step in his development, rather than a death sentence imposed by uncaring adults. The 4 days and nights that Two Bears spent alone on the sacred mountain tested every skill he had learned and every reserve of strength he had developed during his year of preparation. But when he finally returned to the tribal camp, he carried with him the spiritual visions and inner knowledge that marked his successful transition to manhood. "I was right to be afraid when I was younger," he told Jeremiah during a celebration feast held in honor of his achievement. "I would have died if I had attempted this trial before I was ready." but I was also wrong to think that being afraid meant I could never become brave. Years later, when Two Bears had become a respected warrior and leader among his people, he would often speak of the white rancher who had saved his life not by taking him away from his culture, but by helping him find a way to embrace it on his own terms. The lonely rancher who had found a frightened boy hiding in his barn had given him something more valuable than shelter and food. He had given him time to grow into the man he was meant to become. And Jeremiah, whose empty house had been filled once again with the laughter and energy of a young person in need, discovered that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as problems that force us to choose between what is easy and what is right. The boy who had been running from his own tribe had taught the old rancher that courage was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face our fears when we are truly ready to overcome them. The barn that had once served as a hiding place for a terrified child became a symbol of the kind of sanctuary that could be created when different cultures worked together to protect their most precious resource, the next generation. And the relationship between a Lakota warrior and a white rancher proved that understanding and respect could bridge even the deepest cultural divides when both sides were willing to listen with open hearts and minds. In the years that followed Two Bears' successful vision quest, Jeremiah's ranch became an unofficial meeting ground between the Lakota community and the growing number of white settlers in the region. The old rancher found himself serving as a mediator and translator, helping to prevent misunderstandings and conflicts that might otherwise have erupted into violence. His unique relationship with Standing Wolf and the respect he had earned through his protection of Two Bears gave him credibility with both communities that proved invaluable during times of tension. The transformation was not without its challenges. Some white settlers viewed Jeremiah's friendship with the Lakota as a betrayal of racial solidarity, while certain tribal members questioned whether any white man could truly be trusted regardless of his past actions. But the practical benefits of having a neutral meeting ground gradually overcame most objections, and Jeremiah's ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where disputes could be resolved through negotiation rather than bloodshed. Two Bears himself played a crucial role in this developing partnership, serving as a bridge between his traditional upbringing and the changing realities of frontier life. His experience with both Lakota and white culture made him an effective interpreter, not just of languages, but of customs, values, and ways of thinking that often seemed incomprehensible to people from different backgrounds. "You taught me that courage is not about rushing into danger," Two Bears told Jeremiah during one of his regular visits to the ranch. "You showed me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it and wait until you are truly ready to face your challenges." This wisdom proved prophetic as Two Bears matured into adulthood and eventually became a respected leader among his people. His approach to leadership was marked by the same patience and thoughtfulness that had characterized his preparation for the vision quest, and he became known for his ability to find solutions that honored tradition while adapting to new circumstances. When the U.S. government began pressuring Lakota bands to relocate to reservations, Two Bears was among the leaders who advocated for negotiated settlements rather than armed resistance. His understanding of white culture and his friendship with settlers like Jeremiah gave him insights into government motivations and policies that helped his people navigate the complex political landscape of the late 19th century. "My grandfather taught me the old ways," Two Bears explained to a gathering of tribal elders during one particularly difficult negotiation session. "But the white rancher taught me that wisdom sometimes means knowing when to adapt those ways to new circumstances. We can preserve what is most important about our culture while finding ways to survive in a changing world." This balanced approach was not always popular among warriors who preferred the glory of battle to the compromises of diplomacy, but it ultimately saved many lives and allowed the tribe to maintain some degree of autonomy during a period when other Native American communities were being completely destroyed or forcibly relocated to distant reservations. Jeremiah watched these developments with pride tempered by sadness, as he saw the traditional way of life that had so impressed him gradually giving way to the demands of an expanding American nation. But he also took satisfaction in knowing that his intervention during Two Bears' childhood crisis had helped shape a leader who could guide his people through these turbulent times with wisdom and dignity. The personal cost of his involvement in these larger events was significant for Jeremiah. His ranch operations suffered as he devoted more time to mediation and cultural bridge building, and his own isolation deepened as he found himself caught between two worlds without fully belonging to either. The loneliness that had driven him to seek solitude in the first place returned with renewed force, complicated now by the knowledge that his peaceful existence had been permanently altered by his decision to help a frightened child. But there were compensations that made the sacrifices worthwhile. The relationship with Two Bears and his extended family provided Jeremiah with the sense of purpose and connection that had been missing from his life since the death of his own son. Watching the boy grow into a man, and knowing that he had played a role in that transformation, filled a void that Jeremiah had thought would remain empty forever. Standing Wolf, who had initially viewed the white rancher with suspicion and hostility, gradually became one of Jeremiah's closest friends and advisors. The old medicine man's wisdom about spiritual matters and traditional healing practices proved invaluable during the long Dakota winters, while his stories of tribal history and legend provided entertainment and education during the quiet evenings they spent together by the fire. "You saved more than just my grandson's life," Standing Wolf told Jeremiah during one of their philosophical discussions. "You saved our family from the kind of tragedy that destroys both the individual and the community. By showing patience when I showed only stubbornness, you taught us all a lesson about the proper way to guide young people." This acknowledgement meant more to Jeremiah than any material reward could have, representing as it did the acceptance and respect of a culture that he had come to admire deeply. The friendship also provided him with insights into spiritual practices and ways of thinking that enriched his own understanding of life's meaning and purpose. As the years passed and both men aged, their friendship deepened into something that transcended cultural boundaries and personal differences. They shared the common experiences of loss, responsibility, and the challenge of maintaining dignity in the face of forces beyond their control. When Standing Wolf finally died at an advanced age, Jeremiah felt the loss as deeply as if he had lost a brother. Two Bears, now a mature leader with children of his own, took over many of his grandfather's responsibilities while maintaining the relationship with Jeremiah that had begun during his childhood crisis. The bond between them had evolved from protector and protected to something more like father and son, with mutual respect and affection that made the isolation of frontier life more bearable for both of them. "I often think about that scared boy who hid in your barn," Two Bears said during a visit that coincided with the anniversary of their first meeting. "He was so certain that he would die if he faced his fears, but he was also too proud to admit that he needed help. You showed him that asking for help is not weakness, but wisdom." The conversation took place in the same barn where Jeremiah had first discovered the terrified child, now transformed into a meeting place where tribal representatives and white settlers could gather to discuss mutual concerns and resolve disputes before they escalated into violence. The hayloft where Two Bears had hidden now served as storage for gifts and trade goods that represented the ongoing exchange between two communities learning to coexist. Jeremiah, now in his 70s and slowed by age and the accumulated injuries of a lifetime of hard work, found satisfaction in knowing that the sanctuary he had provided for one frightened child had grown into something that benefited entire communities. The lonely rancher who had simply wanted to help a boy in trouble had inadvertently created a model for peaceful coexistence that was being copied by other communities throughout the Western Territories. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had not woken up that morning when you arrived," Jeremiah mused as they stood together in the barn, surrounded by the evidence of all that had grown from that first encounter. "You would have woken up eventually," Two Bears replied, with the gentle humor that had replaced his childhood fears. "The spirits have a way of making sure that the right people find each other when they are needed most." As winter settled over the Dakota prairie, and another year drew to a close, Jeremiah reflected on the unexpected direction his life had taken since the morning he had found a frightened boy hiding in his barn. What had begun as a simple act of human kindness had evolved into a complex web of relationships and responsibilities that had given meaning and purpose to his remaining years. The empty house that had once echoed with loneliness now regularly filled with the sounds of visitors from both communities, while the silent prairie that had seemed to stretch into infinity now felt like the center of a world where different peoples could meet and learn from each other. The lonely rancher had discovered that true solitude was not about being alone, but about being disconnected from the human family that gave life its deepest meaning. And Two Bears, the frightened child who had run from his own people rather than face a trial he felt unprepared for, had grown into a bridge between worlds, carrying the wisdom of both cultures and using it to build a future where his own children might grow up free from the hatred and misunderstanding that had plagued earlier generations. The barn that had sheltered him during his darkest hour had become a symbol of hope and possibility, proving that even the smallest acts of compassion could have consequences that rippled across generations and transformed entire communities.